as the nuclear crisis in Japan appears to be more under control, concerns, of course, are going elsewhere. Where they're going to Europe. The UK has seen a big spike in inflation. It's back in recession. Portugal's talking about huge debt problems. Irish yields going through the roof. So it looks like Europe is very much back in the spotlight. Talk about what's going on in the UK.
Right. It seemed we were obsessed with what was going on in Europe, and now these problems only seem quaint. Oh, it's just a bond crisis? The UK offers this kind of great counterpoint to the U.S. This new regime came in, and they say, we're not going to do expansionism, we're going to do austerity, and we're going to raise taxes and cut budgets massively, and somehow magically the private sector will step in, and that'll keep interest rates low. What's actually happening is the economy seems to be shrinking again, and this is before all the austerity is hit. They push through an increase in the value-added tax, which is a regressive tax, and what does that do? It creates inflation. It makes everything more expensive. They came out with inflation numbers. It's running at 4.4%. That's consumer inflation year over year. And the question is, compare this to the U.S., not just what's happening here with growth. Why don't their companies do a better job, or their system do a better job shielding consumers from the rise in commodity prices? Because here in the U.S., even though lots of things are going up in cost, the overall CPI is only up 1.5% over the previous 12 months. To me, that tells me that the British, they're just not doing as good a job on macroeconomic policy. As bad as it's been here, it's quite awful over there.
Although maybe they're just ahead of us because our CPI has been ticking up in the last few months. A lot of people are worried that we're just starting to see that. But I think more importantly, is the UK a microcosm of what folks like Paul Krugman and others are saying is exactly what's going to happen here if we suddenly clamp down and do an austerity thing? The idea was, basically the UK is Chris Christie in New Jersey. It's like, sorry, we can't afford it. We've cut spending. Paul Krugman has been warning that if we do that, it's going to be an absolute disaster. Exactly what's happening in the UK is going to happen here. Is that true, or is it a different situation?
Well, I think the difference is that the UK is doing it at the federal level. And they don't have sort of state governments the way that we do. So when they go and say, we're going to slash the government budget by 30%, they are literally just laying off tens of thousands of people, cutting services, shutting things down, the way that many states are. The sort of get-out-of-jail card for all these governors who are being so hardcore about spending has been, first, stimulus from the federal government that spares them from some of the costs, and second, that the federal government remains an expansionary force. We still have the Fed that is out there doing QE2, taking all these assets onto its balance sheet. It is not tightening. In Europe, they're talking about potentially raising interest rates. And they still have the federal government, which is running a $1.5 trillion deficit. For all this talk about the Tea Party and the Republicans with their vast efforts to control spending, we've seen reductions in federal spending of $4 billion, $6 billion. We're not going to get a whole lot more. So the state governors in the U.S. have sort of a lot more leeway to talk tough and be hardcore about spending because they know there's this other force that is being expansionary at the same time. And I see that as a big difference between the U.S. and the U.K.
So Neil Ferguson would say that, in fact, the U.K. is doing exactly the right thing. And you know what? They didn't put the economy into recession.
And where does Neil Ferguson live these days?
Harvard.
Yeah, because the universities couldn't afford his salary anymore.
But anyway, he would say that the UK is doing exactly the right thing. They have to go into recession. They've got to get everything under control, and that we are the disaster. We don't know it because we're pretending we have a huge free lunch. We can just spend, no problem. Who's right? I mean, it seems to me we do actually finally have our two petri dishes here, and we're both approaching it from the opposite perspective. Who's going to be better off?
Well, this is a great controlled experiment. My guiding principle is that what Neil Ferguson says about monetary policy and future economic performance is going to be wrong. 2 years ago, you look at his columns, he was talking about how, the Fed's going to ignite this insane inflation in the U.S. and we're all doomed. Inflation has never been lower in this country, no matter what you say about commodity and gas prices. Housing has been deflating. Labor has been deflating. There's no sign of that going up. So we do have this controlled experiment. I think so far the U.S. is doing a lot better. The name of the game is to get growth, to have more people working than there were before, to have more industrial production, to have more output. They are having less. And ultimately, the miracle cure for deficits is a little bit of higher taxes, but mostly it's growth. If you have 4% growth instead of 3% growth, if you have 3% growth instead of 2% growth, you look like a fiscal genius.
So you are saying that the Keynesians have won, that Paul Krugman is right and the Austerians are wrong.
To a large degree, yes. Although this chapter is not, we will know for sure in 3 or 4 more years. But you look at the way things are going, and you look at the trajectory of the UK economy, which is going this way, and our economy, which is going this way, and they have inflation, although they are taking all these efforts to kind of increase confidence that there won't be inflation, and we don't have inflation despite all the things we've been doing that allegedly will spark inflation. So I think so far it has to be judged, much like the Revolutionary War, U.S. wins.
Fair enough.